Good evening. It's Brad Sherman from the Centre for Plant Success in Brisbane. I'd like to welcome you this evening or this morning, wherever you are, to the talk by Veit Braun on bad to think with plants and property relations. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I speaking from, and also you are from. And just to remind you that this seminar will be recorded. The normal process for these events is that Veit will speak for 30, 40 minutes and then we'll follow with questions. So I'll pass it over to him. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you also for the invitation. It's a great honor being part of this lecture series, especially after having seen who else has presented here. I don't think I can quite live up to the quality of previous talks, but I try. And what I'm going to talk about today is thinking with plants about property, or thinking with property about plants. From the on the background of my own PhD research, which already dates a while back. So I started doing my PhD in Munich in 2015 on then a very contentious case in European patent law, which was the tomatoes broccoli case at the European Patent Office. So a case on first sight rather mundane, two plants, a tomato that would dry on the stalk and on the plant, and a broccoli that was high in glycosinolates. And that led to a long, basically, case at the European Patent Office from the early 2000s to about 2020, when it was settled that there wouldn't be patents on, or utility patents on conventionally bred plants in the European Union or in Europe more generally. And there were a couple of concerns that motivated that project at the time. One of them was the concerns about freedom to operate for plant breeders, especially small plant breeders, but also farmers under plant variety protection. There was also concerns about an overextension at the same time, hollowing out of patent law by applying it to something that is not really an invention. And also the old fear about a horizontal and vertical integration of the food chain through patents. And that led to my book that came out 2 years ago, which sort of tries to use this case to ask why exactly we've been talking about property for such a long time in plant breeding now. So you could say that for the last 40 years, at least, property has been a contentious topic, not just in academic commentaries of plant breeding, but also in the industry itself. So all kinds of stakeholders have realized that the property instruments that they have, whether it's personal property, tangible property, plant variety protection, patent laws of different kinds, trade secrets, but also biological technologies like hybrid and terminator systems don't quite work as they were intended to. But the reaction to that is usually that is the argument in the book is to introduce additional property instruments, additional regimes that overlay the existing ones and cause additional problems in turn. So they call again for yet another instrument. And you can sort of see this in the evolution of the last 40 years, all the intellectual and non-intellectual property regimes that have been introduced to plant breeding and compound on each other, leading up to the Nagoya Protocol, for example, and its recent extension to sequence information. So also the understanding of what the plant is expanded through this process. But I'm of course not the first one to talk about property here, and I'm not the first one to observe this. So a lot of the books that I drew from during my PhD, and also authors that you heard already here in this lecture series, have touched upon more or less the same topics from different directions, different disciplines, different angles. So what I would like to use this talk today for is to ask, why is it that we're drawn to plants when thinking of property, and why are we drawn to property when working on plants one way or another? So trying to figure out what these very different books have nonetheless in common, also with my own book. Um, so I want to also add on top of this, I think one of the reasons that we keep talking about property in plants and why there is basically every year a new book about property in plants is that plants remain somewhat of an unsatisfying model for thinking of property. So they're not straightforward. They're difficult to use to think about property. At least that was my own experience when writing my book. So I'm happy with my book in terms of the contents or what I found out about the case itself. I'm somewhat unhappy because it lacks a certain central unifying element. There is this thesis that propertization or the application of property to plants continues and intensifies. But I think what it lacks sort of is an explanation of why property in plants is so moderately successful or unsuccessful compared to other cases. I think plants are a particular model for thinking on property, but also I think what property does to us or does to plants is to offer us a way of thinking about our relationship with plants in a particular way. So it offers itself as a privileged way of looking at plants and telling us what we do with them, what their role in society or in our culture is. So and that brings me to the title of this talk, which is also obviously a nod to Claude Lévi-Strauss and his observation on totemism, which is a rather short essay of his where he tries to untangle this idea of totemism. Why is it that certain groups of people in the world use animals to denote social relationships? And he ends basically at the point with this argument where he says, well, what people do is they use the various relationships within the animal world rather than individual animals to say, well, this relationship is basically analogous to a certain relationship within human society. So they use the relationship between mostly animal species, but also other natural objects or organisms to think about their relationships as human beings. And he says animals are good to think precisely because the animal world is so rich, because there are so many layers and axes of relations that you could use as a model for what you're trying to describe in human society. And I'd say if you would like to extend that idea to plants, you'd have to say that they're somewhat problematic to think with. So what I'm trying to do here is to stay a bit with structuralism, but not maybe with Lévi-Strauss, but more Michel Serres, and try to think of what kind of model actually plants are. So I'm trying to use this structural method of his, as he calls it, and try to extract, you could say, layers of features, characteristics, aspects that plants have in common with other things, or that plants, diverse as they are, have also in common with each other, and think of where the overlaps are, but also where the gaps are, what features plants don't exhibit, and what that in turn tells us about other models for property thought that are also dominant in other traditions of engaging with property. So this has just recently been published in the English translation with University of Minnesota Press. If you want to read, it's a very fun method, and it's not as dense as it looks here. You could imagine it as just dissolving any object, in this case plants, as a couple of sets or Venn diagrams, and think about where their overlaps are, what else is in those sets. And just a very playful, very abstract, mathematical, but not very demanding method. That's mostly really about what is in those sets, not so much about what is a plant on a concrete level, more about the structures, about the relations that it imports into certain modes of thinking when we use it as a model. So what I'm going to do is to look out for these intersections between the different sets of plants and other models, which obviously brings me to the question, what is a model here? What do I mean when I say a model? So I would say that any way of thinking about the world is based on one or more models and usually has a privileged one. And that is used to guide thought. It often exhibits an internal structure, if you look at it from a structuralist point of view, that is then used to extrapolate a certain general theory of the world, of what's going on, what is happening. So you could think about it as a nutshell version of the world if you want to use a plant metaphor. But of course, it also comes loaded with its own normativity. So we use a model case, we use a model object, and then we say, okay, really the world looks a lot like this. And if the world looks like this, where would the problems lie? Where would the solutions be? And the models I'm going to use to compare with plants here are going to be land, commodities or consumer objects, animals, an interesting case, housing too, digital media, and the human body. In many ways, those I would say are the most dominant models, at least that I've come across when writing my PhD, for thinking about property from a social science point of view. I think also more generally in critical legal studies or social legal studies, there's a pretty prevalent. So we have a very interesting set here of models. And of course, it's not exhaustive. You could always come up with another model, another privileged case. So what, for example, is missing here is colonial loot or slavery. But I think in the sense that many of these cases have overlaps with each other, I'm going to touch upon them too. So I'll briefly go through these models and tell you what I think they bring to the fore when we use them. And a classic one, of course, is land, which is often used when we think about histories of colonization, of division and enclosure. So the classical story of the enclosure of the commons, which is here alluded to by the hedgerows in this image, is often used to argue against private property in modern history, and especially in agriculture. Often what is mobilized against it is an idea of the commons. So often livestock herding or a common use of agricultural land. And in this sense, there is a close proximity, especially to political economic traditions of thought. So the question is, how do you properly distribute a finite resource such as land among people so that we could use it to everyone's benefit, but also how could you distribute it fairly? And just because land has such a two-dimensional connotation to it, there's also this idea that there is a good mathematics maybe for dividing it or distributing it. Also, the strong ties to agriculture means that you could think about means of production in a Marxist sense, but also means of subsistence in its extension to agriculture or peasant studies. And that brings it, of course, into a proximity to seed. So in a sense, you could say, as long as you keep seed and land together, land is really not a bad model for thinking about agricultural relations, or a lot of what, especially in the global south, is still a pressing issue. There's also a concern, I would say, in anthropology with decentering the object in property relations. And land is also a good model for that, because what you see when you study it empirically is that you can use land in very different ways at the same time. So, for example, you could use it for recreational purposes while someone else is cultivating that land. And of course, that really dissolves the property object in a way into relations between people. So it's a good way of also thinking about whether property is about people and objects, or really people and people may be mediated by objects. There is, I would think, also this horizontal logic of distribution and a strong rivalry in finite goods, which is sort of somewhat softened in its urban counterpart when you move over to housing, which exhibits many of the same problems, but often is a model used for urban contexts, for urban societies, and more about, I would say, basic needs of city dwellers than about models for production and subsistence. So the assumption is that people who need housing are usually not the people who work in their flats, or that the space of recreation is coextensive with the space of production, for example. But it also is less clear what a good distribution of housing looks like, other than everyone should have their home. On a more general societal level, it's not quite clear, other than some political models that talk about property-owning democracy. So this idea that everyone should own their home and cannot be evacuated from it, for example. That is a strong tradition, I would think, especially in contemporary thought in a lot of Anglophone countries. But other than that, it's not, I would say, as extensive as land in property thought. What I call here commodities, I could also call consumables. Basically, I would say this is the other great model for thinking about property in modern thought. Basically, things that are very unproblematic to own, that often don't require even a contract to transfer, that are very clearly zero-sum games, in the sense that either I can own them or you can own them, I can transfer them, and then no longer own them. I think especially for economics, but I think a history of that would have to be written. This is a very paradigmatic case, and they come with a vertical logic, I would say, of distribution. So there's this separation of the factory, for example, that produces your garments, your food, whatever, and the things that flow out from this factory. And also in this sense, it assumes that this division is unproblematic. It's not quite as unproblematic the moment we move on to a different materiality. And I think digital media have started to dissolve this over the last 50 years, at least, because they suddenly allow you to turn into producers when you buy them. So whenever you copy a file or download music, you implicitly also, you're not just a consumer, you're also a producer. So the materiality that is assumed behind classical commodities or consumables is here undermined, which brings the normative question to the fore. What really is a good division of ownership vertically? So where should the line between producing and consuming, or producers and consumers, be drawn? What are the rights that you actually purchase with a digital copy of a book that you read on your Kindle, and what are the rights that should remain with Amazon or whoever distributes those digital media? Another very important model in property thought, I would say, especially when it comes to modern medicine and biotechnology is the human body. So the development of biotechnology has allowed it to not just think very differently about the body, but also to treat it very, very differently, to move around different body parts, to reattach them. And that raises all kinds of questions about where does really one human individual end, where does another one begin, but also what is the relationship between those detached body parts that may or may not no longer belong to a living subject somewhere else. So what is the relationship between your blood in a biobank? What happens when you die and the blood continues to live? What about your cells? What about your organs that may be attached to a different body? Can we really think about them as property objects? Or is there a better way of thinking about them? And I think the answer is complicated simply because the old idea from anthropology that property objects just mediate between complete subjects on the other side is also drawn into question in this framework. And then finally, and you would think that maybe this is the closest model to plants, and I think for various reasons it's very far away from plants, is animals as models for property. And in a sense, they have a big overlap with the previous case, so with the human body, to the extent that they're used as model animals in medicine and biotechnology. And often, when you think about xenotransplantation, for example, that we also have animal body parts now attached to human body parts or animal genes in other animals. So that also extends, I think, to the animal case. But more broadly, I think animals are sort of a frontier in especially philosophy and ethics for thinking about how far could we extend subject status to things that we currently frame as property, and things I here mean animals. So whenever we talk about animals, I think animal welfare, animal consciousness are always part of the discussion, and that problematizes the application of property to animals in the first place. So I think there is a strong horizon that tends toward the animal as a subject, but also I think that would privilege, if it could, the intact animal body. So what about plants? I think plants are, especially when you compare them to animals, and I did that in my previous postdoc project where I looked at biobanking and animal material, and there it really struck me that certain questions had never occurred in my plant research that I had to deal with animals. I think for various reasons, plants are quite different from animals, even though a lot of the biotechnology tools look very similar at first sight. There are three dominant histories of propertization clearly here. One is that you have the long history of colonization, starting with the transfer of plant material across the world. You have another history of commercialization that I would say starts in the 19th century with the emergence of commercial plant breeding, professional plant breeders that say, I want to do this for a living. I can do this as a science, but I also want to earn money on the market with my seed. So what would plants have to look like if I were to sell them on the market, and what other additional property instruments do I need on top of that? And then maybe from the 1960s, 70s onward, you have another wave of propertization and remaking of plants, which is the advent of green biotechnology. So all the different ways we can now interact and manipulate plants on a cellular and on a molecular level that were not conceivable in the 19th century have added to our understanding, but also have complicated our understanding of plants. and prompted the introduction of new property instruments because these aspects or dimensions of plants were not readily captured by something like plant variety protection when it was first introduced in the 1960s, for example. So we have a certain material fluidity of plants. You can think about them on a cellular level, on the level of plant parts, for example, for grafting seeds, genes, but also whole plants. And I think, unlike with animals, it's not quite clear what the privileged size or shape should be for plants. So if you've got, for example, an insect, you would always think that a caterpillar is less real than a butterfly, for example. Whereas with a seed, I'm not quite sure because you'd always go back and forth between whole plants and seeds. But certain techniques only work on cellular levels or molecular levels. And these plants never really turn into whole plants again. So they live in the lab as cell cultures. And I think imagining them as a body, do plants have bodies in the same sense that animals have bodies, doesn't lead you very far here. The good thing about plants is, or what I at least try to do in my book, is to use other models, the ones that I've shown you before, to approximate certain aspects of plants and vice versa. So in what sense are plants really consumables or commodities that you trade on markets, and what is the precondition for selling seed and assuming that it will just be consumed and not be used to engage in something like illicit competition? So how do you prevent piracy? How is it, in a sense, attached to land and not attached to land? How is it a means of production in agriculture, but maybe differently so than a field or soil fertility? And that helps you also to undermine certain things that you took for granted with the other models. Because I would, for example, say that. I know I'll get to that a bit later. Yeah, I know I'll get to it. Next slide. So you enter into all sorts of discussion of what is pseudo and quasi property. Is intellectual property really different from tangible property? And what really is the difference here? Under what conditions could you really separate tangible and intangible property? And one example here, for example, is if you look at plant variety protection, which is really a property instrument to safeguard the passage of seeds on the market, on a commercial anonymous market, then you clearly see that it extends certain property instruments beyond the sales act. So usually when we buy something, we hand over what anthropologists and legal theorists call the bundle of rights to someone else. It's completely cut. Whereas here, some of the sticks or strings remain attached to the seed that we trade across two parties. And they reappear when we engage in certain practices and realize that they still belong to someone else, even though we've paid the full price for them. But that's obviously true for all commodities that we buy. So if you buy a Mac computer, for example, with an Apple logo on it, you can't just do anything with it. There are assumptions baked into this property model, what a commodity is and what consumption is, what you do with the things you own and what you can't do with them because they still belong to someone else still somewhere in society. And because these spheres are often clearly separated, we don't think about them as property law relations, but I would say obviously they are. And plants are very good at highlighting this. When compared to animals, clearly plants have some sort of agency, but I think attempts to extend this model of thinking about agency as a sign of subject status prove a bit limited with plants. It's often difficult to think about plants even in the singular. There's few plants that we would address as individuals. Trees are one of the exceptions, potted plants maybe, but overall, if you see a field of wheat, for example, you wouldn't think about it as a assortment of bodies or subjects. And then the question is, if agency is not tied to a subject, if it's not about acting or consciousness, what is it? And can you own something that clearly has some form of organic agency still? Um, and then, of course, you use plants for all kinds of purposes, for production, subsistence, consumption. But the diversity of agriculture means that they don't have to coincide. So not all agriculture is subsistence agriculture, and not all plants are produced for food consumption. So the consumer may look very different. It may be a factory that processes canola, for example, into seed oils that are used for lubrication in mechanical industry. And the question is, okay, if that is really the relationship that is mediated by property in plants, what does it tell us about property relations in society more general? And of course, they are in many ways a bit like intellectual property objects or digital media because they can be reproduced and are not strictly subject to zero-sum games, but some zero-sum games apply and some laws of consumption. So you can either consume or plant a seed. And the question is, where exactly is the dividing line here? And what is actually the difference between consumption, production, rivalry, and non-rivalry? So I thought for that, they may be a good model. Um, the conclusion I came to in the book was that this difficult status of plants as a model for property or property as an instrument for plant-human relationship um, leads to certain gaps and problematic overlaps when you keep applying new property regimes, coming up with new ideas of what a good property instrument could be. So you find out that certain elements of plants, certain levels of the plant are not covered by a previous property regime. You introduce a new one and then find out they're entangled and their normativities are conflicting. So, for example, plant variety protection allows you to reproduce the seed um, as a breeder to produce new seed and breed new seed. Patent law does not do this, so you have to come up with a good way of squaring this circle, which is usually a new property instrument on some level. Um, and the last century, I would think, could be written as a history of an increasing entanglement of these various property regimes, and by extension, also of human relationships that are mediated through plants and property in plants, and that are increasingly difficult to disentangle. That is obviously underlaid also by the changing materiality, not just of plants, so their biotechnological remaking, but also shifting, you could say, economic and sociological realities of what it means, for example, to be a breeder, a consumer, a producer, a farmer. So farming has diversified across the world. And it's not quite clear what, for example, a flower farmer in Kenya or a vineyard in France or a grain farmer in the Midwest have in common anymore, other than very vaguely dealing with plants and land. And I think the more we do this, so the more we try to make plants fit to other models of property, or also to make property fit to plants, we have to decide for one or the other. Either we invent new custom-tailored property regimes, but then the question is, if they only apply to plants, are they really good regimes of property anymore? Is this a sui generis right for plants after all, and relationships that are mediated by plants rather than a more general idea of property? And the big question, I think, especially on a practical level for a lot of the practitioners I've talked to for my PhD, so farmers, breeders, intellectual property lawyers, is how can we really disentangle property relations in plant breeding? Where are the spaces that we could do without property in? What are soft property models? What are good substitutes for property when we realize we don't really have a functioning object that we could attach property relations anymore? What could we do on different levels? and maybe also on the material level, keeping various practices from intersecting with each other. But you could also, and then this is what I would like to end with, then ask, what are plants a good model for? And obviously they are good models for certain things, especially because they tell you a lot about other models and property in general. I think for me, what stuck out in this project was that it brought to me to the fore the fundamentalist social nature of most modern property objects. What do I mean by that? Mostly when we speak about social property or socialization, we think about it on a horizontal level. So we have a space that we share, that we all equally partake in, and that we use as equals. Public infrastructure, the commons, flat shares, these things. Whereas I think with plants, we come across a different phenomenon that's highly interesting from a sociological point of view, that they socialize us in very different roles. So they connect us, for example, as farmers and breeders, or as consumers and producers. And at the same time, they don't just reinforce these boundaries, they also problematize them and make them visible as such in the first place. And I think this is what they share, for example, with digital property objects. Unlike digital property objects, I think they come with the advantage that they are embedded in many more forms of materiality. With digital property objects, we often think about code or a certain form of disembodied materiality, whereas with plants, it's not quite clear. You could think about them on that level when you think about sequence information of DNA. But it's obviously not the only materiality that is attached to plants. And it's very difficult to disentangle some of these materialities in the first place. They also show you the difficulty really of governing this whole framework or this whole landscape of different materialities, different stakeholder groups with a very simple thing like property where you think, okay, this belongs to you and not to me, or some of this belongs to you and some of it belongs to you. But what are these parts really? And does it work in practice? And then the question is, how long does it work? 30 years, 10 years, 3 years, or not at all, or only at a very high price. And in that sense, I would say plants are a good model because they are a negative model of a lot of the other models. They tell you what is not included in land as a model of property, for example, or in digital media, in the human body, in the animal body, and in all their peculiarities. So they tell you that there cannot be maybe one privileged model for property, and they are somewhere in the intersection of all the other ones, but maybe in the negative space occupying some sort of gap in their Venn diagrams. Okay, so this is the conclusion I would like to end with, and I'm looking forward to your comments, questions, criticism. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a very great talk. I would just like to, if you want to close the screen, we can see you
Yes.
clearer, maybe. Does anyone have any questions? Sorry, someone's got there's lots of commentary in the chat. Does someone have a question? I've got lots, so I can fill in. Okay. No, okay, I'll start. A couple of well, the last couple of slides, one of the questions you asked is about what plants were good to think, what was good about plants and models and things. And the media, I was thinking of rhizomal, sort of all the rhizomal work that's been happening in philosophy for a long time now. But I was also thinking, what is the difference between plants and other types of subject matter? And I did some work a few years ago looking at patterns on biological material. And the thing that struck me about particularly the molecular level So the patterns over DNA stuff. With plants, they nearly always claim not only the sort of the intangible, but also the physical.
Mm.
Whereas with most human sort of human sort of equivalent of patents, they only
Mm.
ever claim the sort of the DNA level. And I think the simple reason is you cannot own the human body in the same way so plants offer a lot more freedom in some ways
Yeah.
to people to do things. But my question for you is like it's sort of the argument you've made is one that other people are making, not so broadly and not as sort of sophisticated as you in many ways, but people, particularly in relation to the access and benefit sharing, there's been a really big push against that now, and people are moving towards ideas of stewardship instead of property as a basis to
Mm.
think about relations between people. I just wonder do you think that stewardship, how different is it? When you were talking then, I
Yeah.
was trying to replace stewardship with property because people are just saying,
No.
oh, it's great because we care for plants now. But is
Yeah.
it really that different? And I just wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, stewardship is a thank you for these questions, Brad. Stewardship is a very interesting topic in that sense, because it's also said clearly tied to discourses about rights of nature, right? So the moment you bring in rights of nature, what you have to come up with is a good stewardship model also, or a good model of representation for these things. I think stewardship is where I would draw the boundary is that, so stewardship has this implicit idea that you act in the interest of what you have stewardship over, or at least not in your own interest. So the benefactor of the beneficiary of your actions is removed from what would otherwise be the proprietor or the owner of that property. And I think for many things, and I think, for example, economics is a bit quick to merge stewardship with ownership, right? A lot of economic models assume that as soon as you're a owner, you be acting rationally as a steward of what you own. And that's not necessarily true. Or we can imagine situations and frameworks where it's not coextensive. So I think in many ways that addresses certain things that property can't address. For example, things like sustainability, um, collective interests, or also non-human subjects are more easily covered by stewardship. What I think I would be missing from stewardship, or some people, at least in the field, would rather be missing from stewardship, and that's something I would not have expected when starting this project, is that for a lot of people, property has some aspect or function of self asserting themselves as subjects. Because you own something, you are someone. And I think that would be lost to an extent by stewardship. I mean, it wasn't prominently featured here in my talk, but I think this right to reassert yourself because you have the right to own something is highly problematic because there are things that, for various reasons, we can't give to everyone equally. Or should not be owned in the first place. But how do you then substitute for the need to assert yourself as someone in this field? So if you think, for example, as a farmer, about owning your seed that comes from someone else rather than just using it, I think this is a legitimate interest. And I don't know if it's well addressed by either stewardship or by perfect private ownership of the seed.
Thanks. There's a question just come up in the chat, if you can see it there. I'll just read it out. There is this
Yeah.
new WIPO Genetic Resources and Traditional Knowledge Treaty that will allow in a way to challenge claims of patent-based property over plants. Perhaps you would like have some thoughts on, do you have some thoughts on the WIPO treaty, basically?
Yeah. So I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that instrument. What is it? in a nutshell, what does it entail?
It was passed last year. Now was it this year? I'm not sure when it was passed. It basically it there are two aspects of it. One is that it provides a very sort of fairly weak obligation to disclose certain things when uh, inventions are based upon genetic resources
Hmm.
from particular places. And then secondly, there's a sort of suggestion that countries might want to adopt something like the Indian traditional knowledge model.
Hmm.
But it's an obligation to disclose origin of genetic resources. It's been watered down to such an
Hmm.
extent that most Indigenous groups that I've spoken to about it are really not very happy with the outcomes.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah, I would think any instrument like that really depends on how well it's institutionalized.
yeah,
And first of all, it depends on the legal text, obviously. But even if it was a well-written legal text, it depends on how easy is it to access or to challenge these things in practice. How long would the legal process um, usually take? Um, but I think what it is a good sign of is that what I was talking about earlier, it is clearly a sign of self-assertion by indigenous communities, or what we've seen over the last, and maybe since the Rio summit, really. Um, um, the insistence of certain communities, of certain countries of origin, that this is not just an innovation pipeline that's exclusively located in the global north or in developed countries, and that this is to be asserted time and again, mostly on a symbolic level, first and foremost. And I think in that sense, it's probably a win. But of course, the question is, will it ever manifest in something that can also be claimed or really gain on the ground in a lawsuit, for example?
okay. Thanks. Erica?
Oh. Hi, thank you so much. I'm my question kind of I think is I'm a historian, and so I'm
Hmm.
interested also sort of how the terminology in your discipline may or may not sort of club up with things that I know. And so you start out and you're talking about, Levi-Strauss saying that organisms and animals are good to think with, and so I'm thinking about Donna Haraway saying
Hmm.
that, dogs are not just tools with which to think with.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, as you're talking about the materiality of plants at different phases in their lives, um, what do people who are working to turn plants into property do when plants are acting in perhaps an unruly fashion? Are the plants
Hmm.
anthropomorphized? Are the plants stripped of any kind of subjectivity? Does their subjectivity come to the fore? I'm sort of wondering, like, what is the discourse when the materiality of plants moves beyond it being a conceptual tool?
Hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for this question. A very good one. So what I did for this research was I started with ethnography, so classical science and technology studies approaches or microsociological ones, and I went to a commercial breeding company and tried to follow the process of how plants are turned into property. So you start with more or less general germplasm or genes or interesting plants, and you want to turn them into a commodity for farmers, if you like. And I soon realized one of the problems with this process is that the subject that organizes this project isn't just, a person out in the field. Of course, there are also people out in the field, but it is really a legal subject like the company that things in timeframes of 10, 20, 30 years. And it's difficult to extrapolate what the company really thinks or a legal subject thinks about biological subjects or objects. What struck me in hindsight, so when I was dealing with animals, is how that question rarely came up, really. So animal welfare was a big question when I went into microbiology labs that were dealing with with animal DNA. All the precautions that were taken to safeguard animal welfare, and that never occurred in plants. Plants were often just, ripped out, treated as animalities, very statistically, really. It was difficult to even look at an individual plant. So the model I had for thinking about plants was wheat, really. So it was a wheat breeding company. And if you've got a wheat plant, it's got stalks, like 12 stalks coming out of the same plant. It's often difficult to say which of these stalks is the plant or what is the plant. They may have a rhizome underground. And often they are turned into copies of each other. So very heavily homogenized on a genetic level over successive iterations and generations. So I think what I would answer to your question is that I had trouble locating subjects and objects in this clear, singular, localized way. I could tell you what breeders did to plants, which wasn't, treating them with a lot of concern even. They were quite disposable if you think about them from the point of view of, say, a potted plant. But other than that, I think the question really is, what was the object here? Is the singular plant organism the object here, or should we rather talk about plant varieties? And then what does that say about the breeder and the company or the collective? So I think it problematizes things on a very sociological level, and sociology is not very good, I would say, at thinking about property, because it always starts with a very individualized, bourgeois even subject.
Thanks. Shruti, you have a question, I believe.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much, Veit. That was really, really great and really enjoyable. I think I was really interested. I don't know if there is an answer. It's probably a follow-on from Brad's and the other questions about your last slides about disentangling property from plant breeding. And so I guess it just seems like everything that you're saying makes so much sense. It just seems that as we go on, we're getting more and more obsessed with property, and you've alluded to that. And I think sequence information is another example of the obsession with drawing out more and more property in the plant as we go through. So I'm just curious as to where you think this is going, or what ways we could disentangle, or have you seen anything that you might be working on for another model going forward?
Yeah, I mean the best example I have from my own research was this idea of a clearinghouse for patented plant traits. So people who were in favor of, maybe not in favor, who made like a moderate case for patenting plant genes and traits, because they said, someone has to do this work. It's no longer being done by public research for various reasons. So if a company, for example, like Syngenta, or even, a small breeder invests in developing a certain trait and not a variety, if they want to specialize in this, they should at least be compensated on a financial level. They should not get extensive rights to interfere with other people's practices. But there needs to be a good mechanism for rewarding that kind of work, whoever is the person who invests in it. And obviously, patent law is very badly, I think, in the moment shaped for allowing these kind of things. It's very heavy on all the tools that it gives you, from keeping people from using your stuff rather than using it. So they came up with an interesting contract mechanism, a voluntary clearinghouse for certain patented plant traits that would streamline, and I think that's what I mean with disentangling, streamline the use, make it more predictable, come up with fair prices, independent of bilateral negotiations between the patent holder and the licensee. And I think, at least as a model, it's very elegant. I don't know how well it worked in practice, also because most of the conventional patents were later on, discontinued, at least by the European Patent Office. But what the European Union did was to say, okay, we are going to allow new genetic tools, gene editing, for example, in plant breeding, if you can come up with a good mechanism like this in general in the industry. But it's going to be your job to figure out how to do this. I haven't really followed this in the meantime. What I heard from the agricultural side of things, not the vegetables, but more the field crops, was that already there, most of the variety rights holders or big companies weren't really willing to make any concessions on the level of streamlining because they wanted to retain the essential sticks of their property bundle.
Thank you. I think we're coming towards the end. Are there any last questions anybody has? There's lots of chat that I can't really. There's one new one. One is in the chat above. Which is that, Trudy? Do you want to?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can
So,
read it out.
Oh,
Shashank has
yeah.
given us a question of, can we think of developing broad scoping models for conservation and utilization of biodiversity depending upon socioeconomic circumstances of each country? For example, identifying precisely a traditional Aboriginal community in a developed country may be easy, but this may not be so easy for countries like India.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, it would be really good if we could come up with a broad scoping model. I really think so, because the alternative is often a very local, singular solution that isn't easily translated to other cases. But what the question touches upon is really that you would have to reify, for example, the Aboriginal community for a given plant trait, for example, or for a given plant. And that would either do injustice to the reality on the ground, or much worse, it would reify a certain reality on the ground that is maybe not there. So it'd have to keep this Aboriginal community together. And I think there are already cases and examples from Nagoya implementation, for example, where that becomes very tenuous and very problematic in practice. It's not quite clear who the community is. And whether they're Aboriginal or not, who can speak for them. So I think most of all, we should have to come up with a new idea of the property subject maybe here.
Thank you. And I think with that, we might end today's session. On behalf of everybody, I'd like to thank you very much for a very interesting talk. You raised some really, really interesting questions, and it was
Thanks for
great
having
to
me.
finally meet you in person after all this time. And there are some questions. The talk will be posted on the Plant Success website fairly soon. So thank you. Thanks again.
Thank you, Brad, and everyone.
Yeah,
Thanks
thank
for having
you.
me. Have a nice evening now.